Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Thank you for attending this conference. I'm excited to be here. My talk is going to complement that of Alex's statistical methodology talk, as well as Jeff's talk on compliance issues and using data and establishing warehouses, and as well as his great enthusiasm and about some particularly exciting endeavors in real-world data in pediatrics. My talk is going to look at the types of real-world data and the potential uses. It's also going to provide some insights on planning for using real-world data for the purposes of clinical trials. We won't undergo discussions of novel trial design methodology specifically. However, we'll be talking about how the use of real-world data can complement those approaches. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the consideration of composing a real-world data search in pediatric patients. Obviously, most commercially available sources aren't focused on pediatrics. So understanding what the percentage and the total numbers of patients is really key to selecting what real-world data source that one would use and what content is actually there. The second part of this relates to the geographical distribution. The number and type of patients that are available are really important, particularly if you're looking at what regulatory body that you're going to be filing to, or the potential sites that you're going to develop your clinical trial in and execute it in. Understanding of coding is important, as well as the clinical practices aids in successful search strategies, because in many cases it's really important to understand most of the coding for research may be focused around billing purposes and not specifically related to the use of this for a clinical trial endeavor. So it's important to understand that you have to understand different codes might be used to retrieve those additional quality checks to make sure that you have information there that you're actually hoping to get from. The availability of structured fields is always important in determining this, and so having early exploratory analysis to determine whether or not your actual data is retrievable in the data set's really, really important. The other area that's important to consider in pediatric patients is the governance rules. In many cases, in order to protect patient privacy, small numbers or small populations of data may be sequestered or may be limited in value to get to the granularity in order to protect patient privacy. This may be particularly important for ages in younger age groups or in patients with rare diseases or certain oncology diagnoses. Now, the next sort of review point I want to talk about is the type of data set, because it's really important to understand where do you go to find your answers. Utilization data sets are particularly useful, for high-level searches. They're simple. They're basically claims-based elements. They have unstructured elements. They have unstructured elements omitted from them. The structured data really is just coding data related to, the billing codes. You can get, mortality or hospitalizations, but overall, it's overall limited in what you can get from that. Obviously, the source of the information doesn't record medical notes, so that there's not a lot of information and granularity there. It can be useful for using this for high-level outcomes information, things like, the number of patients with a diagnosis, by age, and whatnot would be a question that you could easily answer for utilization data set, but not the actual number of a lab in particular, but you would be able to, like how many milligrams per deciliter, for example. However, you could determine the number of labs that might be available that were obtained in a clinical population. So the whole point is it's less granular. Electronic health record-based data sets, they're typically significantly more complicated because there's a lot of different structures in different EHR systems. Oftentimes the case report form in a sense of the medical record may be different between institutions. So there's a lot more complexity there. They can have structured and unstructured elements to them. They have clinical notes typically, so there's broad fields of information that is not in sort of an Excel spreadsheet box. However, their strength is that you can ask more complicated questions because there's significantly more retrievable data points that you can get to. There can be refined filtering of information, everything from visit characteristics to labs to medical therapies, etc. However, they tend to be burdened a little bit more with governance rules. In contrast, utilization data sets, the number of labs is there, but also the lab values, which is unlike utilization data set. And overall, they're a lot more granular. Now, when I look at registries, this is a popular topic. There's a lot of diversity in registries. Registries typically tend to align towards a medical subspecialty and or a use case, for example, safety or pregnancy follow-up, etc. They're good for natural history. And some that are coming up, like CREATE, have excellent potential for safety and pharmacovigilance. The fields could be structured or unstructured data. They may contain patient-reported outcomes depending on the data that you're looking at. They may or may not be regulatory compliant, so that's something that you will need to consider in the selection. They also may be subject to referral bias and may be less generalizable. One of the things, for example, if it's a patient has to volunteer to enter data into a registry, obviously health literacy and other things come into account, or a patient's perception of disease. Or, for example, another situation might occur where you have a medical condition for that by which the only way you enter into the registry is if you're referred to a medical consult, which means that there's bias towards severity of disease. And so in both instances, there wouldn't be as generalizable. Same thing here with governance rules that would occur with EHR data sets, is that they may also be limited because of availability. Now, if you look at this chart, what I've tried to do is look at use case comparisons of the different data sets and help you understand how would you use them or what things might you use them for. The pluses really represent sort of the basal level, and as you go up in pluses, it implies increased ability to do something. So if you look at defining unmet medical need, for example, for a regulatory submission, or deciding if you wanted to explore a study in a population, of course, utilization registry and EHR are pretty equivalent. Now, if you look at procedures, for example, yes, no, and then visit location, you can get to them in all three of the data sets, but EHR maybe have some advantages, particularly with the granularity in systems. Of course, there can be situations where patients in any of these leave a healthcare system and there'll be sort of a loss to follow-up or gaps in care, but that's something you'll never be able to come with an external look. Use of historical controls, that may be possible with registries as well as electronic healthcare records. Again, that's greatly strengthened if there's the ability to do some kind of chart review to look at specificity and sensitivity, and usually that's done by taking a random allocation of records to see if it fits the population that you're going to be looking at. In addition to that, retrieved from just a general high-level search. Statistical plan in registries and electronic health records do really well there. Disease progression models, registries, and electronic healthcare records. We'll talk a little bit about more of that later. And another important point, when you get consulted on this, generally there's a question about how fast these initiatives cost, or these searches cost, and then how rapidly they're done. And so by generally, utilization data sets tend to be much more rapid because they're less complicated. And it sort of goes down from registries because they're more finite data sets, and then it gets more complicated with EHRs. And it's in parallel very much the same with cost, right? And so those are important considerations. A utilization data search may take less than a month to do versus a very more complicated data search with an EHR may take 6 months or more, depending on what it's being used for. What I wanted to do now in the next few slides is walk through some use cases so you can think about how you might use this in your research. The first one, for example, is feasibility. Feasibility can be done with a regulatory submission to determine, whatever sample size. It can also be done potentially for an orphan drug designation, et cetera. One of the things that we all can appreciate that is site feasibility questionnaires in many instances are biased because it may not be grounded on actual data. It may be based on opinion. The combination of using our outreach or interviews for determining feasibility with real-world data poses some additional strength. Real-world data gives you more of a trend. You can actually see any consistency in numbers of patients that are seen at a study site, and particularly also where they're located and who they're being treated by. So, for example, in this search, this is a hypothetical situation which 50 children's hospitals were screened and utilization data set search. First of all, screened through a diagnosis code, and we'll just say we did IACT-10. That cut down to 577 cases. Given the particular drug class, if we can start filtering by comorbidities or labs that may ultimately be inclusion-exclusion criteria for a clinical trial, so it dropped it further to 271. Looking for maybe a monotherapy indication, looking at patients that haven't been treated by drug therapy, was 233, and then further refinement by eligible patients in the study for additional filtering criteria may only be 31. Obviously, this 31 in and of itself is a number, right? However, if you look at this with additional feasibility questionnaire, you can combine it to look at ultimately what your eligible patient population is. And in this case, from the hospitals that were there, about 25 patients were eligible for the research study. So as you can see, there's some objective approaches as well as objective approaches in doing this. Again, the strength of real-world data is the concreteness. However, real-world data combined with feasibility does offer some advantages. Now, historical controls, I'm just going to say a few points on this. Again, historical controls is useful in rare diseases and pediatric cancers. The key is to match the treatment with control variables, and this can be very simple, such as age, gender, particularly concurrent drugs or biomarkers, or the use of propensity scores. The key thing is that in many instances, the endpoint variables may not be always available, and a chart review may be required, or they may also be required in order to justify, or make more defensible the EHR search identified patients that are used as historical control. And so oftentimes with regulatory discussions, this may be something that strengthens your submission. Now, this was mentioned in Alex's talk. I'm going to go over sort of a search strategy approach for this and not go into the statistical methodologies and just sort of think through what you might do. This is an area that, who's your best friend in a pharmaceutical company is typically someone who knows how to do this, because one of the great things of using disease progression models is for diseases that take a long time to get to an endpoint, one can shorten the trial, or they can use other Bayesian approaches to be able to decrease the sample size. Overall, this is a really good situation or tool to use for diseases that take a long time to have an endpoint reached, and that's in many cases in pediatrics. It involves the use of mathematical functions to quantify and describe time courses of disease, and it employs longitudinal information of markers of disease or biomarkers and tied to a particular endpoint. And like I said, these can be useful for alternative strategies for trial design methods. And as we mentioned, shortening the time, because you can predict the decline of the disease, or particularly the number of patients that will get to the endpoint, they can shorten the time or potentially shorten the number of patients. Now, I'm going to use this example from PedsNet, which is done for patients with chronic kidney disease. This is a real-world data search that was done and presented at a kidney meeting recently. First of all, what we tried to do is to define an unmet medical need population with just looking at a marker of renal dysfunction. The cohort entrance, which criteria really was defined in order to identify patients with early stage renal dysfunction, and this was at estimated GFR less than 90, and then a second GFR estimate of the same and within 90 days, and no intervening elevation in GFR above that threshold limit. And that's a quality control check to make sure that the patients are in a slope of decline in their renal function, so that there's not an episodic increase and decrease in renal function, and there's stability, and that these patients are going to go on to continue to decline. The age of inclusion criteria and eliminating patients who they're sort of at their end stage because they have significant kidney disease are listed there. As well as they're seeing a nephrologist to elicit some bias, for example, in a case might be an acute insult in an ICU, for example, where there's an ischemic injury. It might be a different cohort that you wouldn't want to use. Now, we looked at 3 cohorts: malignancy, patients with glomerular chronic kidney disease diagnosis, and non-glomerular kidney disease. What's important here is also to look at an outcome variable. In many cases, it can be composite to make it more easy to analyze. In this case, given that we were looking at kidney disease, one endpoint that's commonly accepted through regulatory bodies is a loss of GFR. The GFR loss is greater than 50% decline. Ultimately, patients who got less than 15 mLs per minute per meter, 1.73 meters per square, or chronic dialysis or kidney transplant. Now, one of the things that's first done with these type of search is really to define your cohort. This was all the patients in the data set from as far back as we could look. Ultimately screened out for variables that would make them ineligible, down to 7,395 patients, which was 0.1% of the entire population of the data set of all patients. One of the things that is important to this is to make sure you have sufficient numbers of patients available for your analysis, particularly for covariates, because if you don't have that, the conclusions that you can draw from the model are fairly limited. Now, if you look at this chart, it really looks at the clinical demographics based on the subcohorts we looked at. And just some general points, I'm not going to go through this because it's a busy slide, is that the time of the age, looking at similarity in age, so you know which populations you can sort of compare with one another fairly, and that the follow-up is reasonable as the second criteria, so roughly between 4.1 to 5.7 there. And that's important, that you want to have sufficient follow-up to be able to detect change in the course of the condition. There's as well of other assessment variables for you to look at. I mean, gender, ethnicity, and race. I want to draw attention. Another QA check of data is to make sure that the starting filter GFR was within the parameter estimates of the inclusion criteria, because one of the things that can happen sometimes is if your search doesn't filter well, and you can get erroneous queries generated out of the data, and that's a problem, because it will ultimately affect the slope of your estimate. And those are just the other exploratory variables, because you can begin to look at the effects of renal decline on protein, hypertension, and whatnot. The next step in looking at this is looking at which population should we consider effective for unmet medical need. In this case, it's obviously the glomerular CKD, and this is because of the larger percentages of patients overall, the 45% ultimately reach the endpoint compared to an overall group of 20.1% of in the three different groups. Obviously, the key measures were in GFR decline and those reaching estimated clearance of less than 15. But those obviously were of the population ultimately of interest. This can be illustrated as well in the Kaplan Meier curve, and that's one of the things that's easily to identify. And so on the y-axis, you have the percentage of patients not reaching the endpoint, and obviously the patients with glomerular CKD within a period of time, probably about half of them within 2 to 3-ish years, were already there at the endpoint. Now, part of the visualization will tell you, the type of model. If you use linear dropping of the model, you're going to use Cox. This curve has an accelerated curve, as you notice, a line bent, and these are the ratios of survival times on the right there using the Lobo FT method. All of them compared to patients with non-glomerular CKD without comorbidity. I'm not going to go, the ones in the boxes are more alike, just so you know, but then you have the glomerular CKD obviously has significant lower retention rates, meaning that a lot of patients ultimately hit the survival, the composite endpoint. I'm going to pause here and not go into how this might be used for further analysis, but what I wanted to say is that these parameter estimates could then be used for predictive estimates, and that's where coming up with a model is most effective. And I want to stress that this is a very, very important tool to use for diseases that may take significantly long periods of time to reach an endpoint in clinical practice, because these estimates of survival can ultimately be used to predict a shorter duration of time or a more effective sample size. Now, in conclusion, I want to stress that real-world data is a very powerful tool in pediatric drug development. It has the potential to increase the efficiency of therapies studied in pediatrics. It's really important to consider it early and strategically when you're looking at regulatory strategy and looking at clinical practice. And then as well as encourage others to advocate for its use in future drug development programs, because in many cases it's not the first thing that people go to. And thank you for your time and your attention.